Well, welcome to the laboratory of the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum. Now, when a fossil is excavated by a paleontologist, it goes on sort of a journey through several different places and gets changed over several times through different people on its way to being used in research or going on display. The laboratory is usually the first stop that a fossil makes on its journey through a museum, and there's a lot of work that goes into preparing a fossil for its eventual use as a display piece, in research, or both. Now, when a fossil gets brought in from the field and into the lab, it often looks something like this. As you can see, this barely looks like a fossil at all. It's covered in this plastered burlap, what we call a field jacket, and it's covered with dirt and bits of rock and things like that. All this stuff needs to be removed from the fossil so we can see it sort of in its best possible condition. Now, for the most part, this is a pretty low-tech operation, preparing a fossil for use in our collections, research, or display. And here's some of the tools that we use in order to do that. This is probably the most common one. It's just a simple dental pick. So this is what you get your teeth cleaned with when you go to the dentist. Other things you might end up using are paintbrushes to sort of brush away the sand and dirt and muck from the fossil. And to get out the really fine stuff, you could even use a toothbrush. It's really fun when you use these on dinosaur teeth because it feels like you're brushing their teeth for them. And then sometimes we even use sharp-bladed scalpels in order to really scrape the compacted on dirt and muck from the fossil. So it can be just that simple. And I like to say, if you can brush your teeth, you can learn how to prepare a fossil. But that's not where it sort of ends. There's a lot of expertise that needs to be developed in order to work your way up to more and more challenging fossil preparatory challenges. Now, what I've got here is a nearly finished fossil prep project. Now, this is a fairly easy or entry-level one. It's a rib from a very common dinosaur to this area called Pachyrhinosaurus, which was a big horned dinosaur. Now, ribs like this are fairly common, and they're also pretty easy to prepare once you learn the basics. Our volunteer here has removed all the dirt and rock and glue that was caked onto the fossil, and it looks a heck of a lot better than it used to. So that's all it kind of takes. Now, eventually, as a fossil preparator, a lot of people work their way up to more and more complicated challenges. Larger dinosaurs, especially very fragile specimens, tend to take a lot more practice and skill with, coaxing them out of the rock and keeping the bones all nice and together and keeping the integrity of the fossil all well and good. So it's just about as much an art as it is a science to get right. Now, what I've got here can safely be described as a much more challenging project. Now, this is an entire skull, or a mostly complete skull, of a Pachyrhinosaurus. So you can see it's a lot larger than the rib that we saw earlier, and it's a lot more delicate. There's all these cracks that need to be filled, all these areas that need to be glued, and it would take a lot more time and skill to work on something this size. But just like with any skill, all it takes is a lot of practice. And here's one of the tools that somebody who would be working on a skull like this would be using. And it's this thing right here. It looks like a little pick attached to a hose. And what this is, it's a little handheld drill called an air scribe. And all it does is the air gets pumped through here, and it makes this little tip at the end go forward and backwards really, really quickly. And then all our technician does is applies that to the tip of the fossil, and it chips away the rock and dirt from the bone. It's a bit of a delicate operation. You don't want to damage the fossil while you're doing it, but it certainly speeds up the process more than just using hand picks and brushes and things like that. Now, this great big contraption that you see over the fossil is just essentially a big dust vacuum. So when you're using your air scribe on a big fossil like this Pachyrhinosaurus, you're going to blow up a lot of dust. And you don't want that dust to get all over yourself or to breathe it in, or to cover the fossil or your laboratory. So this big machine here sort of sucks it out of the air for you, which is very handy if you work on fossils that are covered with lots of dust. Now I'd like to introduce you to our resident fossil technician. This is Calla Scott, and she is our fossil preparator. Now you can see her using the air scribe here, that handheld drill, and just very carefully she's removing all the extra rock from the skull of our Pachyrhinosaurus. So this is a job that is quite demanding. You don't want to, work too closely to the bone, or else the air scribe can damage the surface of the fossil, and there's really no way of fixing that. And you can see it also takes a lot of protective gear to protect your breathing, your ears, and your eyes. So it's not always a very clean job, but as you can see, Calla is quite good at it. Now here's another relatively advanced fossil project that we got here, and this is one that I actually played a very small role in collecting myself. Now this came from just west of the museum at a place called the Beaver Lodge River, and you might look at this big block of rock and think, what the heck is it? What could possibly be inside this great big block of sandstone? Well, these are some bones from a dinosaur, and what we're looking at here is the underside of a dinosaur's backbones or vertebrae. So these spines here, which look like they're sticking up, would actually be sticking off to the side of the dinosaur's vertebrae. So we're looking at kind of near the bottom of the dinosaur's hip region. This V-shaped bone right here is called a chevron, and they sort of project downwards off the bottom of a dinosaur's tail, and there would be a blood vessel running between those V-shaped prongs on the chevron. Now you can see all these crisscrossing lines on the rock there. That's from that air scribe tool that we saw earlier. So as you can see, even though we have some handy power tools, it still takes quite a long time to be able to chip away through all that rock. So this is a project that's probably more months or even years in the making, as opposed to several hours that it would take to do something small like a rib. Here we are by the toolbox, and I like to think about fossil laboratories a little bit like workshops. In both cases, you have a space full of tools and equipment which are used by very skilled people who take time to learn their trade and work a lot with their hands and often aren't afraid to get a little bit dirty. And the whole process is something that you begin as an apprentice, and then you work your way up to sort of an intermediate role in a lab or a workshop, and then by the time you've been doing it for quite a few years, you're kind of an expert, and you spend some of your time teaching the next generation all the tools of the trade. So hopefully you can see the connection between things like workshops and laboratories, even though one is a bit more scientific, both are equally interesting and valuable.